are professionals who develop over years of practice what they experience as reliable intuition, the capacity to assess people or situations quickly through pattern recognition refined by repeated exposure, the confidence that comes from having made hundreds of similar decisions and having those decisions generally prove adequate if not optimal. Thomas Avery had spent 19 years as director of operations for a regional consulting firm, during which he'd been responsible for hiring approximately 200 people across various roles and levels, and he believed his interview judgments had been substantially more accurate than random chance would predict, that he developed genuine skill at identifying candidates who would succeed versus candidates who would struggle or fail. This belief was supported by what seemed like evidence. Most people he hired performed adequately, serious hiring mistakes were relatively rare, his department maintained acceptable turnover rates and generally met its operational objectives. There had been some failures, people who'd seemed promising during interviews but who'd struggled once actually doing the work, people who'd lasted only months before leaving or being managed out, but these were minority cases that Thomas attributed to factors he couldn't have reasonably predicted during interview process, personal issues that compromised work performance, misrepresentations during interviews that he'd failed to detect, situations where someone's capabilities genuinely didn't translate to the specific context of his organization despite appearing relevant on paper. But the overall track record seems solid enough that Thomas trusted his assessment process, trusted his ability to distinguish strong candidates from weak ones based on relatively brief interviews, trusted that his 19 years of experience had calibrated his judgment in ways that made his hiring decisions reliably better than those of less experienced managers who might be swayed by surface characteristics or who might fail to detect warning signs that Thomas had learned to recognize. His interview approach had become systematized over those 19 years, had evolved from initially uncertain attempts to assess strangers through structured conversation into refined process that felt almost automatic. He'd ask certain types of questions designed to reveal specific qualities, questions about handling difficult situations to assess problem-solving capacity, questions about past projects to evaluate actual accomplishment versus claimed capability, questions about working with others to understand interpersonal skills and team compatibility. He'd observe body language and tone, looking for signals of confidence or uncertainty, of honesty or performance, of the subtle differences between people who genuinely knew what they were talking about versus people who were skilled at appearing competent without having underlying substance. He believed he could reliably distinguish these signals within the first 10 or 15 minutes of an interview, that subsequent conversation was primarily about confirming initial impressions rather than fundamentally revising them. This efficiency was valuable. Interviewing was time-consuming, he typically had multiple candidates to assess for any position, being able to quickly identify strong versus weak candidates allowed him to allocate his attention appropriately, spending more time exploring promising candidates while not wasting effort on people who were clearly not suitable. The firm where Thomas worked, Whitmore Consulting, was mid-sized organization providing management consulting services to corporate clients, employing approximately 140 people across 3 office locations. Thomas's role involved overseeing operations across these locations, ensuring that projects were adequately staffed, that consultants had resources required to serve clients effectively, that administrative and support functions operated smoothly. His department included approximately 30 people directly, with another 40 consultants working on project teams that he coordinated with but didn't directly supervise. The work environment was professional, deadline-driven, required people who could manage ambiguity and pressure, who could interact effectively with clients who were often skeptical about consultants generally, who could produce work that was both analytically rigorous and politically navigable within complex organizational contexts. Finding people who possessed this combination of qualities was challenging. Many candidates had strong analytical skills but struggled with client relations, or had good interpersonal skills but couldn't produce the kind of detailed strategic analysis that consulting required, or had both capabilities but couldn't handle the work intensity and deadline pressure that characterized consulting schedules. Thomas's hiring success had been based partly on identifying people who possessed all these qualities, but also on recognizing that different roles required different balances. Senior consultants needed more client-facing sophistication, junior analysts needed more technical capability, project coordinators needed more organizational skills. His interview approach adapted to these different requirements, asked different questions and looked for different signals depending on what role was being filled. But underlying all these variations was consistent preference for confidence, for people who presented themselves with assurance, who answered questions decisively, who demonstrated the kind of professional polish that Thomas associated with successful consulting work. He'd learned over the years that clients responded positively to consultants who projected confidence, that internal team dynamics worked better when people could make decisions without excessive deliberation, that the pace and pressure of consulting work required people who could move forward without being paralyzed by uncertainty or self-doubt. This preference wasn't consciously articulated as bias. Thomas would have said he valued competence over style, would have insisted his judgments were based on substance rather than superficial presentation. But in practice, when faced with candidates of relatively similar qualifications, he consistently chose the more confident presenters, the people who answered quickly and assertively, the people who projected the kind of polish that suggested they'd be effective in high-stakes client meetings and internal leadership contexts. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Thomas was interviewing candidates for a senior project coordinator position, role that involved managing multiple consulting projects simultaneously, coordinating between consultants and clients, ensuring deliverables met quality standards and deadline requirements, handling the operational complexity that allowed client-facing consultants to focus on analytical and strategic work rather than project administration. The position was important. Poor project coordination created cascading problems that affected client satisfaction and consultant morale, but wasn't high-profile or particularly prestigious, was primarily behind-scenes operational work that received attention mainly when it was done poorly. He'd received 43 applications for the position, had narrowed these to 6 candidates worth interviewing based on resume screening, and was conducting those interviews over Tuesday and Wednesday. The schedule was compressed, he had other responsibilities demanding attention, wanted to make hiring decision quickly to fill position that had been vacant for 3 weeks since previous coordinator had left for different opportunity. Elena Moreno was the third candidate interviewed, scheduled for 10 a.m. She arrived at 9:50 a.m., checked in with reception, waited in the firm's lobby area reviewing what appeared to be notes she'd prepared. Thomas observed this briefly when he emerged from his office to greet her, noted that she appeared composed, professionally dressed without being particularly stylish, carrying herself with what seemed like appropriate professional demeanor if not particularly memorable presence. He brought her to a conference room used for interviews, neutral space, glass walls providing visibility to firm's open office environment, table and chairs arranged to create relatively informal conversation setting rather than interrogation dynamic. Thomas had his interview notes and Elena's resume in folder, though he'd memorized the key points already, had formed preliminary impressions based on her application materials that this interview would either confirm or complicate. Her resume showed strong academic background, undergraduate degree in business administration from Solid State University, MBA from similarly reputable program, both with good grades though not exceptional. Her work experience showed steady progression through project coordination and operations roles at 2 previous employers, each position lasting 3 to 4 years, increasing responsibility with each move. Her skills and qualifications matched the position requirements closely, experience with project management software, demonstrated capacity to handle multiple concurrent projects, references that spoke positively about her organizational capabilities and reliability. Nothing about her background was remarkable, no prestigious institutions, no household name employers, no unusual accomplishments that would distinguish her from other qualified candidates. But nothing raised concerns either. She appeared to be exactly what her resume suggested, competent professional with relevant experience who would probably perform the role adequately without being exceptional. Thomas began with his standard opening questions, asking Elena to describe her background, to explain what had drawn her to apply for this position, to outline what she understood about Whitmore Consulting and about the role she'd be filling. Elena answered these questions thoughtfully, speaking at measured pace, pausing briefly before responding as if considering her words carefully rather than delivering rehearsed answers. Those pauses registered with Thomas as potential signals of uncertainty. The strong candidates he typically hired answered questions fluidly, demonstrated the kind of confidence that came from knowing their own narratives well and being comfortable articulating them under pressure. Elena's measured responses could indicate thoughtfulness, but they could also indicate someone who lacked the quick decisiveness that Thomas associated with successful performance in high-pressure consulting environment. He moved to more substantive questions, asking Elena to describe how she'd handled difficult situations in her previous roles, how she'd managed competing priorities, how she'd dealt with conflicts between stakeholders with different objectives. Her answers demonstrated clear understanding of project coordination challenges, showed she'd encountered similar situations to those she'd face at Whitmore. But again, the measured quality of her responses created slight discomfort for Thomas. She wasn't performing confidence, wasn't presenting herself as someone who'd mastered these challenges, was instead describing them with what felt like almost excessive honesty about their complexity and about her own learning process. When Thomas asked about her leadership experience, how she'd influenced teams or stakeholders despite not having formal authority, Elena told story about a project that had failed. Had described initiatives she'd proposed that hadn't worked as intended, had resulted in wasted effort and missed deadline. She explained what she'd learned from the failure, that she'd been too focused on process efficiency without adequately consulting the people who would actually use the systems she was creating, that her proposed solution had been technically sound but practically problematic, that she'd revised her approach in subsequent projects to incorporate more stakeholder input earlier in design phase. The story was clearly honest. Most candidates would have either avoided mentioning significant failures or would have framed them as situations where they'd eventually succeeded through heroic recovery efforts. Elena did neither. She just described the failure straightforwardly, without defensiveness or self-aggrandizing narrative about lessons learned that made the failure somehow valuable. Thomas found this unsettling, appreciated honesty in principle but also wondered whether someone who admitted failures so readily might lack the resilience or confidence required for consulting work where failure was common and ability to maintain client confidence despite setbacks was essential. He wrapped the interview after 45 minutes, thanked Elena for her time, explained that he was interviewing several candidates and would make decision within the week. Elena thanked him for the opportunity, shook his hand with appropriate professional firmness, left the conference room and the office without any of the lingering or attempts at additional connection that some candidates deployed. Thomas made notes on his interview form: strong technical qualifications, relevant experience, thoughtful responses but somewhat hesitant, may lack decisiveness required for high-pressure environment, admitted project failure without attempting to reframe positively, concerning honesty or confidence issue. He rated her overall as acceptable but not preferred, continue with other candidates before deciding. The remaining 3 interviews that day and the 2 scheduled for Wednesday included a candidate who impressed Thomas significantly, David Chen, 34, MBA from more prestigious program than Elena's, previous experience at a larger consulting firm, presentation during interview that was polished and confident, answers to questions that demonstrated both competence and the kind of assertiveness that Thomas associated with consulting success. David told stories similar to Elena's, project that had encountered significant challenges, but framed it as situation where his leadership had successfully navigated difficulties and ultimately delivered results that exceeded client expectations. Thomas believed David's framing was probably somewhat exaggerated. Most projects that encounter serious challenges don't end with exceeded expectations, but the confidence with which David told the story felt appropriate for consulting work, suggested he'd be effective in client contexts where projecting confidence was often as important as actual expertise. By Wednesday afternoon, Thomas had decided to make David an offer, felt confident this was the right choice based on his assessment process that had worked well for 19 years. Thomas sent offer to David on Thursday morning, received acceptance by end of day. He then sent rejection emails to the other 5 interviewed candidates, including Elena, using template he developed that struck appropriately professional tone without providing specific feedback that might create legal exposure or awkward follow-up conversations. The email thanked Elena for her interest, noted that they'd had many qualified candidates, indicated the position had been filled by someone whose background aligned slightly better with their specific needs, wished her well in her job search. He sent the email without hesitation, without second thoughts, without any particular awareness that this decision might be something he'd later question. It was just another hiring decision, executed efficiently according to his established process, moving forward to the next operational responsibility demanding his attention. David started 2 weeks later, went through standard onboarding, began working on project coordination that had accumulated during the position's vacancy. His first week seemed fine, he was confident, asked reasonable questions, appeared to be picking up the role's requirements adequately. Thomas checked in periodically, received positive reports from project teams David was supporting, felt validated in his hiring decision. After 6 weeks, David gave notice. Had received offer from a larger consulting firm with significantly higher compensation, had decided to accept despite his relatively brief tenure at Whitmore. Thomas felt irritation. Losing someone after just 6 weeks meant returning to hiring process, meant the operational challenges that had accumulated during vacancy would continue accumulating during search for replacement, meant his original decision had failed to produce the stable staffing he'd intended to achieve. But this wasn't unprecedented. Consulting had high turnover, ambitious people frequently moved to better opportunities, competitive hiring market meant that talented people had options. Thomas didn't interpret David's departure as reflection on his hiring judgment, just as unfortunate timing, as David having been in market for position even while accepting Whitmore's offer, as situation that was impossible to predict during interview process. He initiated new recruitment, posted position again, began receiving applications. This time he wanted to move more slowly, wanted to find someone who would stay longer, wanted to avoid repeating the situation where training investment was immediately lost. He reviewed applications over several weeks rather than rushing to interview immediately, gave himself time to identify candidates whose background suggested stability rather than just upward mobility. During this review process, he found himself looking again at applications from the previous hiring cycle that hadn't resulted in offers. This wasn't unusual practice. Sometimes strong candidates who weren't selected initially were worth reconsidering, particularly if they were still available. Thomas opened several of these archived applications, reviewing them with fresh perspective now that he wasn't operating under the compressed timeline that had characterized his first hiring decision. He opened Elena Moreno's file. Read through her resume again, this time without the pressure of comparing her to other candidates, without the time constraints that had made his first review relatively superficial. He reread his interview notes, tried to recall the actual conversation beyond the abbreviated summaries he'd recorded. Then he read the reference letters she'd submitted, which he'd only briefly scanned during initial review. One letter was from her previous manager at her most recent employer, a woman who'd supervised Elena for 3 years. The letter said standard positive things about Elena's competence and reliability, but one sentence stood out to Thomas now in ways it hadn't during his initial rushed reading. Elena improves systems quietly. You notice her absence more than her presence. Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at that sentence. It was unusual phrasing for reference letter, was almost double-edged, could be interpreted as praising Elena's effectiveness while also suggesting she wasn't particularly memorable or visible. But reading it now, several months after his initial review, with more time to actually consider what it might mean, Thomas began to recognize it as describing something valuable that his interview process had failed to identify or value appropriately. Elena had been quietly effective. Had improved systems without needing recognition or visibility. Had been reliable enough that her absence was what people noticed. The evidence of her value was that things stopped working as smoothly when she wasn't there, rather than things working more smoothly when she was there because her contributions were dramatic or obvious. This was exactly what Thomas needed in project coordinator role. The position wasn't about being visible or projecting confidence in client meetings. It was about making complex operational systems work reliably, about managing details that allowed consultants to focus on client work, about being person whose effectiveness was demonstrated through absence of problems rather than through presence of dramatic interventions. David had been confident and polished, had projected exactly the qualities Thomas associated with consulting success. But those qualities were primarily valuable in client-facing roles, weren't necessarily what mattered most for behind-scenes operational work where quiet reliability was more important than assertive leadership. Thomas had hired David partly because David's presentation matched his template for successful consultants, without adequately considering whether that template was actually appropriate for this specific role. Over the following months, as Thomas continued searching for project coordinator and as various people temporarily covered the role's responsibilities, he noticed things he hadn't noticed before David's brief tenure and departure. The operational systems that project coordinators managed were complex, required understanding multiple projects' timelines and dependencies, required balancing competing priorities from different project teams, required maintaining relationships with clients without overstepping into consultants' territory, required attention to details that seemed minor until they weren't handled and created cascading problems. The people temporarily covering these responsibilities struggled in ways David had struggled but that Thomas hadn't fully recognized during David's brief time in role. They were capable people, consultants who could handle complex analytical work, who could interact effectively with clients, but the project coordination work required different capabilities than consulting work required. Required patience with administrative details that consultants found tedious, required maintaining systematic tracking that felt unnecessary until something fell through cracks, required the kind of quiet persistent attention that people who were drawn to more visible strategic work often lacked. Thomas began noticing when things went wrong, missed deadlines because coordination between teams wasn't managed effectively, client frustration because deliverables didn't match expectations that hadn't been clearly documented, consultants spending time on administrative tasks that should have been handled by support systems. These weren't catastrophic failures, projects still completed, clients still received value, but the operational friction was higher than it should have been. The consultants were less efficient because they were managing coordination themselves rather than being able to focus purely on analytical and strategic work. And he began noticing how different problems were when coordination was handled effectively versus when it wasn't. During periods when experienced coordinators from other projects would temporarily help, things would suddenly work more smoothly, communications would flow appropriately, deadlines would be met without last-minute heroics, consultants would express relief about not having to manage operational details themselves. These improvements were quiet, there weren't dramatic visible changes, just reduction in friction and problems that made everything function marginally better. This was what Elena's reference letter had been describing. You notice her absence more than her presence. The value was in preventing problems rather than solving them dramatically, was in creating systems that worked reliably rather than systems that required constant intervention, was exactly what Thomas needed but what his interview process had failed to adequately identify or value. 6 months after rejecting Elena, Thomas attended a regional professional conference focused on operations management and consulting efficiency, not something he attended every year. But this year's programming had included topics relevant to challenges he'd been experiencing with project coordination and operational systems. The conference brought together operations professionals from various consulting firms, provided opportunities to learn from others' approaches and to maintain professional network. During one afternoon session focused on project management best practices, Thomas noticed Elena's name on the speaker roster. She was part of a panel discussing leadership in operational roles, speaking alongside 3 other operations professionals from different firms. Thomas felt complicated reaction, surprise at seeing her name, slight guilt about having rejected her, curiosity about what she'd been doing in the months since that interview. The panel discussion was substantive, focused on challenges that operations professionals faced when supporting revenue-generating consultants who often didn't fully understand or value operational work. Elena spoke eloquently about these dynamics, described them with the same measured thoughtfulness Thomas remembered from her interview, but in this context her measured approach seemed like wisdom rather than hesitancy. She talked about leadership not as visibility but as responsibility, about the importance of restraining impulse to make oneself central to solutions, about knowing when not to speak and allowing consultants to take credit for work that operations support had enabled. The room, maybe 60 people, mostly operations professionals dealing with similar challenges, responded positively. Several people asked questions specifically directed at Elena, clearly finding her perspective valuable. Thomas watched this, experienced uncomfortable recognition that his interview assessment had been wrong, that the qualities he'd interpreted as weakness, the measured responses, the honesty about failure, the lack of self-promotion, were actually strengths in operational contexts, demonstrated sophistication about role requirements that David's confident presentation had lacked. After the session concluded, Thomas approached Elena, uncertain whether she'd recognize him or remember the brief interview from 6 months earlier. She saw him coming, smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth rather than the forced professional courtesy that characterized most conference interactions. "Thomas Avery," she said, clearly remembering. "From Whitmore Consulting. Thank you for interviewing me. I know it didn't work out, but I appreciated the opportunity." Her tone carried no bitterness, no edge of resentment about rejection, just straightforward acknowledgement of what had occurred. Thomas felt suddenly worse about the situation. Her graciousness about being rejected made his decision seem even more obviously mistaken. "I should have hired you," he said, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to say them, honesty driven by guilt and recognition rather than by any calculated professional consideration. Elena looked at him thoughtfully. "You hired who you thought you needed," she said simply. "Different people are right for different contexts. It sounds like you were looking for someone with different qualities than what I offered." The response was remarkably generous. She was essentially excusing his judgment while also implicitly acknowledging it had been flawed, was offering him graceful exit from uncomfortable acknowledgement of error without making him feel worse than he already felt. Thomas recognized the sophistication in this response, recognized it as exactly the kind of interpersonal skill that would make someone effective in operational roles where maintaining relationships despite tensions was essential. They spoke for several more minutes. Elena asked about Whitmore's operations, Thomas asked about where she'd ended up, a slightly larger consulting firm, similar project coordination role, both maintaining professional courtesy that kept conversation from becoming awkwardly personal. But Thomas carried away from the interaction a clear understanding that he'd made mistake, that his interview process had failed to identify someone who would have been excellent in the role he'd needed to fill, that his preference for confident presentation over substantive capability had led him to choose poorly. Thomas didn't immediately transform his hiring approach. Couldn't simply abandon 19 years of developed practice based on single instance of recognized error, couldn't suddenly trust that his entire assessment framework was wrong just because it had failed in one case. But the recognition stayed with him, created ongoing discomfort that gradually influenced how he conducted interviews and evaluated candidates. He started paying more attention to what candidates said rather than to how confidently they said it, started creating space in interviews for thoughtful pauses rather than interpreting pauses as signs of uncertainty, started asking different kinds of questions designed to elicit honest reflection rather than polished performance. When candidates described failures, he stopped interpreting honesty as weakness and started seeing it as evidence of self-awareness and learning capacity. These changes were subtle, were modifications to existing practice rather than wholesale replacement. Thomas still valued confidence, still looked for people who could handle pressure, still needed candidates who could project appropriate professionalism in consulting contexts. But he became more attuned to different ways these qualities could manifest, became more suspicious of perfect polished presentations that suggested someone was performing competence rather than actually possessing it. He hired 3 project coordinators over the following 18 months. None of them stayed long enough for him to fully evaluate whether his revised approach was producing better outcomes, but all of them performed adequately while present. None replicated David's pattern of leaving after just 6 weeks. The role continued to be challenging to staff. Good operational professionals were in demand, consulting firms competed for them, turnover remained higher than Thomas would have preferred, but his revised hiring approach at least seemed to not be making situation worse. He occasionally thought about Elena, wondered how her career had progressed, recognized that she'd probably advanced beyond role he'd been hiring for and that his missed opportunity to work with her was permanent rather than something that could be recovered. He didn't reach out to her, that would have been awkward, would have suggested he was trying to retroactively redeem his judgment rather than just learning from it, but he kept her in mind as exemplar of the kind of professional capability his previous approach had systematically undervalued. 2 years after their conference encounter, Thomas was interviewing for different role, senior operations analyst position that would involve strategic operations work rather than just project coordination. One candidate stood out clearly during initial interviews, confident, polished, articulate about previous accomplishments, exactly the profile Thomas would have hired immediately based on his old assessment framework. But Thomas made himself pause, made himself look more carefully at other candidates whose presentations were less impressive but whose actual work history suggested different kinds of capabilities. He structured second-round interviews to create space for more substantive conversation, asked questions designed to move past rehearsed answers into more genuine exploration of how candidates actually thought about operational challenges. One of these second-round candidates was a woman named Sarah Park, 39, with background similar to Elena's, steady progression through operational roles, strong references that emphasized reliability and quiet effectiveness, interview presentation that was thoughtful rather than polished. Thomas found himself drawn to her despite his lingering preference for more confident presenters, recognized that his discomfort with her measured responses was exactly the bias he was trying to overcome. He hired Sarah. She was excellent, brought exactly the kind of systematic thoughtfulness and operational sophistication that the role required, improved processes in ways that took months to fully manifest but that created substantial value once implemented. 2 years later she was still with Whitmore, had been promoted to lead operations across all office locations, had become one of Thomas's most valued colleagues despite never being the most visible or celebrated person in the organization. Thomas couldn't know whether Elena would have been similarly successful. Hiring is uncertain. Any individual case could succeed or fail for reasons unrelated to interview assessment quality. But Sarah's success validated that his revised approach could identify valuable professionals who his previous framework would have systematically overlooked, that learning to look past polished performance to substantive capability was possible even after 19 years of practicing different assessment logic. He never forgot the specific regret about Elena, never stopped recognizing that he'd made clear mistake with her, that his interview judgment had failed in ways that probably also affected other hiring decisions he'd been less aware of. But he carried that regret forward as useful rather than just painful, as reminder to question his own certainties, as evidence that even experienced judgment could be improved through attention to its failures. Some lessons arrive too late to fix, but not too late to learn from. This is what Thomas discovered through rejecting Elena and eventually recognizing his error, that the mistake couldn't be undone, that he'd lost opportunity to work with someone who would have been excellent, that his flawed judgment had real consequences he couldn't retroactively correct. But that recognition, while painful, could still inform future decisions, could still improve how he assessed candidates going forward, could still prevent him from repeating the same error with other qualified professionals who didn't match his narrow template for success. The challenge with experiential learning is that experience can reinforce biases as easily as it corrects them. Thomas had 19 years of hiring experience that had created confidence in his judgment, but that experience had also systematically shaped his preferences in ways that caused him to overvalue certain qualities, confidence, polish, quick decisive responses, while undervaluing others, thoughtfulness, honest reflection, quiet effectiveness. His experience had been teaching him the wrong lessons, or at least incomplete lessons, and it took clear failure followed by ongoing observation of its consequences to begin recognizing where his judgment was systematically flawed. This pattern extends beyond hiring specifically to any domain where we make repeated judgments based on limited information. We develop what feels like intuition, what seems like reliable pattern recognition, what we experience as expertise. And some of that intuition is genuinely valuable, represents real learning about how to distinguish signal from noise, about what predicts success versus failure in specific contexts. But some of it is just accumulated bias, is pattern matching that privileges certain presentations while missing substantive capability that doesn't conform to expected templates. The call to action isn't to distrust all experiential learning or to assume that expertise is always biased. It's to remain open to recognizing when your judgment might be systematically wrong, to notice when your confident assessments produce unexpected outcomes, to be willing to question assumptions you've held for years when evidence suggests they're leading you astray. And when you do recognize clear errors, when like Thomas you realize you've made objectively wrong decision, to carry that recognition forward not just as shame or regret but as useful data that can improve future judgment. Thomas's hiring approach wasn't completely wrong, much of his assessment framework was sound, many of his judgments were appropriate. But his systematic preference for confident presentation over substantive capability was bias that led him to consistently undervalue certain kinds of excellence, to miss opportunities to hire people like Elena who would have been highly effective but who didn't perform competence in ways he'd learned to recognize and reward. So examine your own judgment patterns. Notice when you're consistently preferring certain types over others based on presentation rather than substance. Question whether your confident assessments are actually as reliable as they feel. And when you recognize clear errors, resist the impulse to explain them away or to defend your judgment as having been reasonable given available information. Sometimes your judgment was just wrong, was based on biases you developed through experience that felt like wisdom but that was actually systematic blindness to certain kinds of capability. That recognition is uncomfortable but useful. Can't fix past mistakes but can prevent repeating them. Can't hire Elena retroactively but can avoid rejecting future Elenas based on same flawed assessment logic. Can turn regret into improvement, can use painful recognition of error to calibrate future judgment more accurately. Be StoryWise.